Jim had always been the kind of person who avoided complications. His life, like his apartment, was small, quiet, and simple. The kind of life that was easy to ignore if you didn't look too closely. The apartment, tucked in the heart of the city, was nothing special. Cheap rent, peeling wallpaper, a window that barely opened, and the faint hum of the traffic outside. He'd lived there for 8 years, and for most of that time, the apartment felt like a place to sleep, and nothing more. The furniture was basic, the walls a dull beige. The kitchen was cramped, but he didn't mind. The only real comfort he had was his old recliner by the window, where he could sit for hours staring out at the city. It gave him a sense of calm, a feeling of being untouched by the chaos just outside his door. It was one Thursday night, about 2 weeks into an especially stressful stretch at work, when it first happened. Jim had just gotten back from his shift and was preparing for another night alone in his apartment. He dropped his keys into the dish by the door and noticed something strange. His recliner, the one he always kept by the window, was not where it belonged. At first, he thought it was his imagination. He was tired, overworked, and the room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but no. The chair was facing the wrong direction. It had been turned, just slightly, but enough to make it obvious. It wasn't much to be alarmed by. Jim just shrugged and moved the chair back to its usual spot. He had more important things on his mind. But as he sat down, a flicker of unease curled in his gut. The chair was too empty. For the first time, he felt like the room wasn't quite his own, like something in it was out of place. But he told himself it was nothing, a trick of the tired mind. He turned on the TV and tried to forget about it. But the next morning, it happened again. The recliner had moved, this time farther, almost to the center of the room. Jim stood frozen at the entrance, blinking in disbelief. His first thought was that maybe, in his exhausted state, he had moved it the night before without remembering. But the more he stared at it, the more he felt a chill creep up his spine. This time, he didn't touch it. He simply stood there, his heart beating faster, trying to figure out if he was going mad. The strange thing was, it wasn't just the chair that seemed wrong. The apartment itself felt different. The air was heavier, thick with a weight he couldn't describe. The light streaming through the window seemed faint and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere else entirely. Jim was tired. Maybe he was sleep-deprived. That had to be it, right? The third night, it moved again. And this time, it was impossible to ignore. The chair had shifted even farther, and there was no way Jim could have moved it by accident. He had placed it in the farthest corner of the room, just to the left of the window. But now, it was facing him, angled toward the center of the room. Jim's stomach twisted as he stepped forward, a strange instinct urging him to walk over and push it back in place. But before he could reach it, he heard it, the soft creak of wood. The sound wasn't coming from the chair, though. It was coming from the floor beneath him, as though something was shifting beneath the surface of the apartment itself. His breath caught in his throat. He spun around, scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the chair, sitting there, waiting. He couldn't explain it. The chair had never done this before. And why this chair? Was it just the exhaustion? The pressure of his job? His mind was playing tricks on him, right? But he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was closing in on him, the walls pressing in like they were growing smaller. The air tasted thicker, harder to breathe. Every shadow felt alive. The next few days were a blur. He stopped sleeping, unable to shut his eyes for fear that the chair would move again. He kept all the lights on, even during the day, hoping the light would somehow chase away whatever was lurking in the corners of the room. But no matter what he did, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the chair. It was everything. When he went to the kitchen, the refrigerator door would be slightly ajar, even though he was sure he had closed it. The faucet would drip, but it wasn't just water. No, there was something strange about it. A metallic taste lingered in the air. But the worst part wasn't the oddities that kept appearing. It was the shadows. Every time Jim walked into a room, he felt a presence behind him. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, moving with him, always there, just out of view. And then, one morning, as he was brushing his teeth, he noticed something in the bathroom mirror. He froze, toothbrush still in hand. His reflection wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first. His reflection blinked too slowly, his movements delayed. But then it got worse. The reflection of his arm twitched, jerking back slightly, like something wasn't quite in sync with the real him. He stepped forward to look closer, but the moment he did, his reflection smiled. It wasn't his smile. Jim dropped the toothbrush, his heart slamming against his chest. The reflection in the mirror was staring at him, its face twisted in a grin that wasn't his own, its eyes gleaming with something sharp and predatory. That night, Jim couldn't take it anymore. He called his landlord, told them he needed to leave. The lease was up anyway. It was time to move on, start fresh. But when the landlord showed up the next morning to inspect the apartment, he paused at the door. "Funny," the landlord said. "I thought I saw someone in here with you last night." Jim blinked, the words a cold rush through his veins. "What?" The landlord shrugged. "Yeah, some tall guy. I don't know, just standing there in the corner. Didn't say anything. Weird, right?" Jim's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone about what was happening in the apartment. No one. How could the landlord know? How could he have seen someone else? The next night, Jim packed up the last of his things, determined to leave once and for all. He didn't look at the chair as he grabbed his bags. He couldn't. But when he reached the door, he paused. He had locked the door earlier, hadn't he? He turned, staring at the chair. It was facing him now, and it was empty. Jim's heart raced. Something was wrong, something deeply, fundamentally wrong, but he didn't know what it was. Then, the sound came. A low creak, like something bending, straining against the walls of the apartment. He turned to face it, and that's when he saw it. The chair wasn't empty. It was occupied. A tall, dark figure sat in it, its long arms draped over the arms of the chair, its head tilting ever so slightly to the side. The thing smiled at Jim, its face smooth and featureless like clay. "Hello, Jim," it whispered in a voice that was both inside his head and in the air around him. "You've been so busy looking at the chair, but I've been waiting for you to notice." The next day, the landlord arrived to find the apartment empty. The furniture had been moved, the walls scraped clean of any personal touches. The only thing left behind was the chair, sitting by the window, facing the door. And if you listened closely, you could hear the soft breathing coming from inside.